Welcome. In the previous example, we saw using Bootstrap CSS dependencies, and we created a simple ReactJS application where a form entry can be filled and populated in a table view. I'm going to do the same thing, but here I'm going to split the views into various components. And of course, for added uh, benefit, we can reuse the component. The previous example, we had our form which where we enter the student name, subject, and the roll number. The same form can also be used for editing purpose, and we'll also expand the space used for table, and we'll display or we'll render the views on conditional basis. So whenever required, we'll display and hide it when not required. So that's a plan today. So I'm going to create a new project. I keep all my uh, React.js project files inside a folder called React.js. You may choose your own. Okay, so we were using npm, so React app. If you are using npx node package executables, make sure you use npx create react app to give a project name. So yes, I'm going to say 2. So the intention of this tutorial is to how we can make use of React components and tie them into a single view and transport the data between the components. So in the previous example, I was heavily relying on state, but in this case, I might also use props, and of course, I'll conditionally render the views or the components whenever required. So we can make ourselves comfortable with props and state one more time. Okay, now the project is ready. This is the project name I gave. Make sure I open that into. Okay, let me have it started. Okay, let it boot. We'll also, I think, I forgot to add the Bootstrap dependencies, because this example also I'm going to use Bootstrap for CSS, purpose, and of course, it would be better we have a nicely looking applications created. So I'm using Bootstrap. Okay, let me stop it for a while. Let me add Bootstrap dependencies. There are few things the Bootstrap has dependent on: Bootstrap and jQuery, and also popper.js. Make sure that the entry added in package.json, that's why I'm giving a flag save. Let it download. Okay, here, so that's what I was planning to create. I'm going to create few components, and using those components I'm going to render the same example what I did in the previous one, where I had a add edit form. Now, of course, edit we didn't complete, but we'll complete it over here. I'm going to create a couple of components to start with. I'm going to name one as add edit, because I plan to use the same component for adding and editing purpose, and one more for okay, and we'll expand it. We'll start from here. Okay, so the render function with the return state. So what it is going to display, it's going to be, we had to decide about it. So before that, let's check all the dependencies. Okay, it's still doing downloading all the dependencies, so let it complete. We'll also complete the rest of the components meanwhile. Okay, it's a your choice, keeping it default or not. The component, I'm going to keep the same. Just going to rename. Okay, I have 3 components ready. Okay. Okay, now we'll have to plan. The very first screen, in this case the app, it's going to display only the buttons where it's going to render the add form on edit form. So I'm going to restructure all those things which we did in the very first example with the bootstrap. We wrote everything in a single page. We wrote everything in app component itself. Now the strategy is slightly different. So let me start with considering the bootstrap installed. We also notice it is touching the header, so we can also add style attribution, and it can also take a JavaScript object. Remember, within the curly brace the JavaScript objects can be specified, so the object I'm directly specifying, not to get confused with the 2 curly braces kind of thing. The very first curly brace is for the place where we write down JavaScript object, and internally I'm writing the JavaScript object itself. So a normal CSS, I mean, the key values can be written, but in this case, since in the JSX I'm defining it as a JavaScript object, anything separated by hyphen will be replaced by uppercase letter. So in a real CSS scenario, padding hyphen TOPT will be a lowercase one, but it's now it became a kind of a camel casing here. That's a slight difference. So some value, let it be. I think it's done with that. Okay, since we started, let's complete up to one level. I'm going to keep 2 columns which is having a equal width, I mean 6 proportion of the 12 grid column. I'm going to keep a button. We'll name it add. And we'll name this close. Danger, slightly look a dark color, maybe in red it will be displaying. Okay, how it's going to come, let's see them. I know I'm just not going to need it. started. Okay, and we need to do a couple of things in order to make sure the bootstrap to take effect. So let it start. Let's go to index.js where we can add the bootstrap dependencies. Port. It's all located inside a distribution folder, dist folder. So the CSS and JS, and finally both the dependencies which required to be added. So without that it's looking so bad, and once we add these dependencies and save, let's see how it's going to look like. Okay, now we got the button skinned the way how it looks like in Bootstrap. Okay, and I think probably I'll do one thing. I'll keep this the close button to the extreme right, so float hyphens right, which is a class name for keeping a view to the extreme right. So now, so the space is separated by equivalently 6 and 6, and of course to the left add button, to the right the close button we have. So when the user click on add button, we are going to display the form. Okay, let's see how we can do that. So the form, in this case, we are going to keep it over here. So this is the place we are going to give the form. Same way, the logics have right now been separated. So the typical form will look like in Bootstrap. So this is the tag groups the label on. So name. This is going to give it. Okay, I think to avoid confusion, I'm going to make it as a first name. Value will keep it later. Yes, the strategy has got changed. You can complete the tag. The very important one, the class definition, so that the form looks better. It's got form control. So this is the form. Let's keep it minimalistic. Okay. Let's see how we can render it. So let's see how we can conditionally render this inside this component. We already have. Okay, one second. Let me see it. Okay, I'll wrap the entire the form within a row. I'm going to keep within a row, and also I'm going to keep, of course, the row require a column to be specified. Okay, let's make a small one. This format. I think the 12 column size, but I'm keeping it in this way. So let's slightly keep it bigger. Maybe there should be some space which required to be offsetted because it is each a row takes a 12 size grid. Right now we occupied only 8. The rest we can offset it. Before that, let's see how it is going to look like when the add button gets pressed. So in this case, I'm going to require a function. We've already discussed why we prefer fat arrow based function. Of course, the flexibility to access the context or this keyword. So we'll be throughout the exercise we'll be using add fat arrow based function. Okay, so now when the add button gets pressed, so let's call this one. Okay, and of course it's also going to have an event, but we are not depending on the event now. Okay, so when this gets pressed, we are going to display a view. So now I'm going to need a state to handle, because whenever something the change or anything which required to be dynamically changed, the state object would be required. So I'm going to implement the constructor to set the default state values. Of course, as we know, the constructor takes the props argument. Okay. Unlike the previous example, this time the state is going to be slightly different, which also going to hold a couple of information. And okay, I'm going to do a couple of things. Show form, I'm going to say set to false to start with, and the records which I'm going to display, and that's also I'll keep it over here, but if required we'll move the place. So the show form is a boolean value. Okay, now I'm going to put a little bit of condition over here. We'll keep a horizontal line separating. Okay, so the JavaScript expressions can be written here with a curly brace inline. There are various ways to do it. I prefer a conditional approach, as we talked about a condition since in one of an example I think I remember talking about. So condition, if it is true, this block will be executed, otherwise the false block will be executed. So this is the sequence. I'm checking a condition. If the condition set comes true, this is the object or block it's going to execute, otherwise this is the one. So I'm going to use this strategy over here. So this state show form, if it is true, I'm going to render the add edit component. If not, just display an empty space. So whenever the show form comes true or the object comes true, this block will be. So thanks to JSX, and of course it's also any Java, XML, JavaScript XML, it's going to behave as if an object. So when the show form value comes true, and this is the one will be displayed. If it is false, this is an empty string, or maybe just invisible one. Okay, so now we are going to call set the state So form I'm going to set to true. Sorry, so the previous practice. So it's going to set so form to true whenever the add button gets pressed. So let's see this thing in action. Okay, when I click on add, see that the form becomes visible here. Okay, I think we need to offset a little bit. Before that, let's make the close button also. This is going to set to false again. So when the close button gets clicked, okay, when add clicks, the form become visible. When close click, the form become invisible. I mean, not invisible, it's removed. So the view is not actually occupying any space here. So when I click here, the form becomes visible. Okay, this offsetting part which needs to be done. So we have just occupied almost 8 proportion of the 12 grid system, and let's see how we can offset it. So let's offset uh, 2 space. So to the left of this column, now it's going to display. We see that now it comes because the 2 proportion offset has been done. That eventually push the form into the center because the remaining will be again the 2. So 2, 2, 4, and the rest goes for this form. So 8, so 12 column has been formed. So now it looks into the center. Okay, let's put the button in order to complete the form. Okay, so when this button gets pressed, the form will be submitted, and we know how to handle the form submit. So we are going to need a function. So I'm going to create a function. It will also hand over me an event. So where's the form here? So on submit, we call this function. Okay. So when the save button gets clicked, the form submit will trigger here. We just prevent default so that it doesn't refresh the page. So prevent default. Okay, now the form submit will be handled. Okay, I think we haven't given the class to make it look better. btn okay, so the page won't refresh though. Okay, this is for add purpose. So how we are going to handle the data here so that the table could be populated. But before that, let's go and complete the table. That also will render. So this is the form we created as a separate component. We conditionally render it whenever required with a conditional statement here. So if it is true, the form will be rendered, or the add edit component will be rendered, otherwise empty. So let's complete this one. Okay, I want to keep everything within the row columns, so let it be a bigger one. It occupies the entire space. Okay, the table. The bootstrap table, border table, will be having this class attribute values, table table hyphen border. Okay. Using table header so that we'll have all our headings. So that primarily it's going to have the serial number, name of the student, roll number, and finally the subject. So this is the heading and the body of the table. It's going to be a dynamic part. So we'll expand it. So we have our table ready, but we need a data source to expand it. But before that, how we are going to render this? So let's add another horizontal. Okay, there is already a horizontal line. Okay, so here we probably render the table only when there is data available. Okay, but as of now I'll just render it. We'll use certain props to populate the table. Okay, now we have the table showing up. Of course, when you click on add, that along with the table, the add form also will appear. So we can also probably add another condition. When the form is visible, we really don't want to show the table. So the state show form, if it's true, we are not going to display anything. If it is false, we will display the table. So just we are toggling a different view between it. Okay, so when the form is visible, the table will become invisible. When I close it, the table will appear again. So we conditionally render the components in this case. So we separated the logic now, all those things in separate components now. Now we need to have data which is going through it so that whatever I type on the form goes to the table and displays. Here comes a little complication. I mean, unlike the previous example, we really didn't think about communicating or sending data between the components. But here we'll have to think about it. But thanks to props, the component has a built-in object which can take input from one component to another. So we can put that into use. Okay. Before that, I'm going to go to view here. So we are typically using an array to produce an output for table rows, especially for this table. So I'm going to use, assuming there's going to be a property okay, this dot props, assuming a property exists called students. Not to get confused, I mean this object I'm going to pass it maybe all students, I'll name it, just to avoid confusion on what we are. Okay, assuming this is something will be sent from here, say as an argument. So we can pass it, so the props will pick up, and this actually is going to be students because we also maintain over here. So this props will land from here naturally to this component. So now it's the map which will take care of iterating each entry of this array to prepare the row. I'm not going to spend much time writing a function. I'm going to write
because in JavaScript the functions also behave as an object, so it can be passed as an argument. So let me write the function straight away within this parenthesis. So there are two, one the object, the very object, and the index. See, be careful when you are doing it, and there might be losing the nesting. So here this is a function which has a fat arrow, block, and necessarily it is going to have a return statement. Because the very purpose of using JavaScript map is it has a return statement, and also it produces a new copy of an array which suits well for the render. So let me write the tr block. So the rest of the blocks can be written. Keep it organized. First name. I think we also have a serial number which I'm going to display as an index. First name, roll number, and that's it, I hope. Subject. So there's only 4, not the 5. Okay. So as the value lands here, this will produce table rows and the subsequent value. And of course, it requires a key attribute to be defined because render expects each elements are unique. So we are actually passing, sorry, it's a JavaScript object, the index itself. Now we are done with this. We also make sure save this one. Just going to refresh one more time. I think it's something, an error, something might have happened. Did it save properly? Okay, I think it looks like for me some error because by default nothing should. Okay, I think there's no error because we are toggling the views. So by default the view table will be displayed, and when I click on add form the table will disappear. This will be okay, fine, it works, but no data as of now. Okay, it's fine to keep the web inspector open for us. So if any some error comes in, we can solve that. Okay, now this part is fine, and we'll have to do a couple of other integrations in order to send the data in between the add edit component and this particular component called app. Okay, because through where we get the data. Let's expand the add edit component because this is where text inputs are located. So these text inputs are, of course, as the user type, the data changes. So the changing nature comes mean it's better to use the state. Anywhere we would be required to track the changes, naturally we will require the state object, so which I am going to use. The props would not require, so typically read-only entries. And of course, if you notice, I haven't used the state in table because the app sets the value as an input, and whenever the state changes over here, the re-rendering is going to happen with the new value. So that's why I didn't use state over here. So, but here I would have to use the state because it has inherently certain form inputs which the state we need to be tracking. So sorry, state following objects which I am depending on, default values, okay, and also we need to have a function to track on the text field value changes, so because chances are there the values of course the values are going to be changed. So there are a few things we need to do. One, let me call it in the second line, value, set the value from the state, also call the onChange attribute and point the function we created. So we are going to do this for the rest of the input fields. And also we need to track the change, and in the previous example itself we used the switch case. So the key is going to be the name, the values being what are the name attribute we have defined, let's keep everything organized. Okay, now set the state, individual state. See the habit, I complete the function block, then go and pass the argument, which is to avoid the nesting capabilities of sometime, we might be losing the focus on the nested elements. So it requires an argument, JavaScript object argument. In this case, we are going to set the first name through the event target value. So same stuff for the rest of the thing. This key is roll number. Subject. So this state object will be tracking the changes, and when form is submitted, we will be fine to have the values. In this case, the values have to be sent to app.js or this app component, because this is a kind of a central dispatch component. This component acts as a wrapper for all the components. So this is a place where all it keeps data, where the interchanging requirement comes in, where the data from one component comes here and then it transferred to the another component. In this case, the add edit will hand over data which would be transferred to this view all component. So this one acts as a kind of a middle or maybe a wrapper or enclosure for all the components. So in order to do that, I'm going to need a help of a function. On okay, we'll have to differentiate for which purpose the add and the edit works. Some name on data ready, some function is I'm going to. So this function will have an object, and that can be added to the student object. Okay, and this one has to be immutable point. So we have to do first create a we know how to create a copy of an array. state students, and then add a new object. So we'll have a, so oh, sorry, maybe new. I would recommend avoid this new keyword, but anyway, so it's a full word, so fine. So whatever object comes in will get added over here. So now set the students object, a new student. Okay, so when the state changes, a new value comes in. Naturally, this block will get called because it is a state object. So the view all component will be re-rendered. Okay, so we'll have to do, and when the data is available, and we'll also make sure uh, set the form to false so that the data disappears. I mean the form disappears. Okay, now we need to call this function from here. So how we are going to do that? So that's exactly the problem here. In order to do that, I'm going to use props to send the function to this component, from this component to this. Okay. Let's come here. Let's pass handle data kind of attribution I'm declaring. I mean, this is the one who's going to take on data ready. Make sure to bind it to this because the function is located inside app component or app.js. So it has to execute in this context or within this class. But when I send this object to another component, that might be executed within that particular component context. So I don't want to have that to happen. So I need to make sure the function is executed here only. So for that I'm pointing, okay, this is the context this particular function will get executed. And now the handle data prop is the key for us to hand over the data. Let me save it, go here, this dot props. I can send the object. Okay, it's going to have a lot of things and I'll have to make sure because okay, I think these are all 3 data it has, so I can directly send. So this object will land here and will execute here. The form entry will get cleared. I mean the object will have added to this array, and the array will make sure, but since the change of array has happened, the view all will be refreshed. So let's see everything in action. So I'm going to click on save. See that the entry has come here and the form disappeared, and of course I have an entry available here. Let me add one more. See that the values are coming in and the data is being handed over to this particular function. So now we made use of the bind capability of it. So changing the context means the function have to be executed in app.js rather in the context of added it. So that's, and of course since JavaScript accept functions are as an object, so I can transfer it as an argument. So handle data is a property or props through which I am pointing. So far I was pointing only objects, strings, and maybe arrays. In this case, I am pointing a function itself having the bind transferred to this particular context, in this case app.js, and now the values are coming in here. So now handle data press and I see the data landing up here. Now we see that the entries being added dynamically. Things are looking pretty good. So what we have done in this example, we have separated the components. Now this particular example is having a conditional rendering. Only the components will be rendered when required. If not, will not be shown at all. And of course, I could distribute the logic across different components rather than keeping everything within that. For a large application, you can feel this kind of strategy would be very worthful. For a small application, I think that won't be a problem to keep everything within the same component. But I'm just assuming we'll also learn like how we can distribute the components. Remember, so far what I have done uh, is like I'm conditionally rendering the view, but I'm not making use of any other kind of a URL based routing. It's just within the page, everything loaded, removed when required. So this is the app component which becomes a wrapper for all the components. In this case, I added it. Okay, now we need to expand the logic. We need to give an option for edit. So when the user click on it, the data goes here, user press run, then the data gets modified. So how we can do that, that's we have to see. And subsequently uh, we can move on to the rest of the topics such as routing or how to add the React routing and all stuff. So this is a very simple example. We conditionally render the components.